Think of Earth as a living entity, not metaphorically but literally, a complex system that regulates itself, that breathes through forests and ocean currents, that has survived asteroid impacts and solar flares. Now imagine this planetary being sensing something new, something outside its long experience, approaching from the darkness. Would it not respond? Would it not prepare? The ionosphere, that delicate shell where our atmosphere meets space, began to shimmer with electrical potentials never before recorded. Satellites passing through these regions reported anomalous data streams, their sensors overwhelmed by patterns that defied categorization. It was as if our planet had developed a fever in response to something foreign, something that challenged its equilibrium. Those sensitive to electromagnetic fields, people who had always felt the approach of storms before they arrived, who experienced migraines when solar flares erupted, began to report strange sensations, a pressure behind the eyes, a tingling at the base of the skull, dreams filled with geometric patterns that lingered upon waking. Were they simply responding to heightened media coverage, to the collective anxiety sweeping across continents? Or were they somehow attuned to something the rest of us couldn't yet perceive? In cities across the globe, strange power fluctuations occurred simultaneously, aligned perfectly with the monster's predicted trajectory. Streetlights dimmed momentarily before brightening beyond their normal intensity. Digital clocks reset themselves to random times. Electronic devices picked up unidentifiable low-frequency hums that made speakers vibrate even when turned off. An engineer in Toronto recorded these vibrations, filtering out ambient noise until only the pure tones remained. When played back at double speed, the resulting audio bore an uncanny resemblance to whale songs, those complex vocalizations we've studied for decades without fully understanding. When she shared her findings online, others reported similar recordings from locations thousands of miles apart. The patterns matched almost perfectly, despite the vast distances separating them. What kind of phenomenon could affect global infrastructure simultaneously, bypassing the normal constraints of cause and effect, of signal propagation through time and space? Scientists called it coincidental, though few believed this explanation. Some suspected a coordinated cyber attack, others an unusual solar event, but those who had been following the monster's journey recognized its signature, that way of being both present and absent, of affecting reality while remaining just beyond our comprehension. It was as if the monster was testing Earth's technological nervous system, sending gentle pulses to measure our response. Or perhaps it was attempting communication through the only medium it could access, our electrical grid, the artificial neural network humans had built around their planet like a second atmosphere. Perhaps to a being that existed beyond our understanding of physics, our technology appeared as an extension of ourselves, a way to touch our consciousness. Consider how we study simpler organisms, observing their reactions to stimuli, their patterns of movement, their responses to changes in their environment. Are we being studied in the same way? Is the monster conducting an experiment with humanity as its unwitting subject? And if so, what is it trying to learn about us? Some scientists suggested the monster might be sampling our electromagnetic emissions. The cacophony of radio waves, television broadcasts, internet traffic and military communications that Earth has been sending into space for over a century. Perhaps it had intercepted these signals from afar and come to investigate their source. Like a curious explorer following the sound of voices through a forest, others proposed a more troubling possibility, that the monster had always been here, dormant or hidden, and had chosen this moment to reveal itself. That its apparent approach from deep space was merely a way of managing our perception, of giving us a narrative we could comprehend rather than the more disturbing truth that something had been watching us all along, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. Whatever its nature or intention, the monster's effect on human consciousness was undeniable. People who had never given much thought to astronomy or cosmology suddenly found themselves contemplating the stars. Those who had lived their lives within the comfortable boundaries of the known began to wonder what else might exist beyond the edges of our perception. A collective awakening was occurring, a shift in perspective that transcended cultural and geographical divides. In New Delhi, a young woman who worked as a software developer stayed up all night creating a visualization of the monster's trajectory based on the limited data available. The resulting animation showed not just its path through our solar system, but the ripples of gravitational distortion that accompanied it, waves of altered spacetime, that seemed to both precede and follow its movement, like the bow wake of a ship passing through water. When she shared her work online, it was viewed millions of times within hours. Something about the visualization captured people's imagination. Perhaps it was the beauty of those gravitational waves, or perhaps it was the way the monster seemed to dance through space rather than simply moving through it. Whatever the reason, her visualization became a touchstone, a way for people to conceptualize what was happening beyond the atmosphere. On the final night before its expected closest approach, the world held its breath. Observatories were locked down, access restricted to essential personnel only. The skies seemed eerily still, the stars watching in silent witness. Some people gathered in open spaces, eyes turned upward, expecting either transcendence or catastrophe. Others locked themselves away, seeking the illusory safety of walls and roofs against something that existed beyond physical dimensions. In Central Park, New York, thousands assembled despite official advisories against large gatherings. They brought telescopes that would show them nothing, cameras that would capture only darkness. What they sought was not evidence but communion, the shared experience of witnessing together whatever was about to unfold. Similar gatherings occurred in London's Hyde Park, in Tokyo's Yoyogi, in Rio's Ipanema Beach. Humanity, faced with the unknown, sought the comfort of connection. Some believed the monster would collide with Earth, ending civilization in an instant. Others thought it might pass harmlessly by, vanishing back into the void from which it came. Religious leaders spoke of judgment, scientists of opportunity, politicians of unity in the face of the unknown. Each interpretation revealed more about the interpreters than about the monster itself, their fears, their hopes, their understanding of humanity's place in the cosmos. A Franciscan monk in Peru described it as the eye of God, turning at last toward his creation. A quantum physicist in Copenhagen called it a manifestation of probability waves collapsing into observable reality. A poet in Kyoto wrote that it was the universe dreaming itself awake. Each was trying to place the unplaceable within a framework they could comprehend, to make meaning from mystery. Amid this tension, reports emerged of a strange glow visible over the Earth's poles, curtains of silver light, tracing invisible movements in the sky. Like aurora borealis, but more structured, more deliberate. Those who witnessed these lights described a sense of profound peace, of being in the presence of something ancient and wise. A pilot flying over northern Canada captured video of the phenomenon, ribbons of light that moved with intent, forming patterns that seemed almost calligraphic, as if something were writing in the sky with a pen of pure energy. The footage went viral, analyzed by experts who could explain the mechanism of ionization, but not the purpose behind the patterns. Some claimed to see mathematical sequences in the arrangements. Others described them as musical notation, a visual representation of harmonies too complex for human ears. Were these merely ionospheric disturbances caused by the monster's unusual gravitational field? Or were they a form of communication? A gentle announcement of presence, a way of saying, I am here, I see you, I mean no harm. The beauty of the phenomenon suggested something beyond mere physical interaction, perhaps even a kind of greeting, an aesthetic gesture from one form of consciousness to another. Consider how humans have always used beauty to communicate, through art, music, dance, architecture. These are not simply decorative activities, but fundamental expressions of who and what we are, attempts to convey meaning beyond the limitations of language. If the monster was indeed trying to communicate, perhaps it chose beauty as its medium, precisely because it transcends the barriers of different evolutionary histories, different perceptual systems, different ways of being in the world. As the hour of predicted closest approach arrived, a strange calm settled over the planet. The wild oscillations in electromagnetic fields suddenly stabilized. The distortions in gravitational measurements resolved themselves. Even the weather, which had been unusually volatile in the preceding days, grew still and clear as if the atmosphere itself was holding its breath in anticipation. In observatories around the world, scientists watched their instruments with a mixture of professional detachment and human awe. This was the moment their careers had prepared them for, contact with something from beyond, a chance to expand the boundaries of knowledge. Yet many found themselves distracted from their instruments, drawn instead to look directly at the sky with naked eyes, seeking a personal connection with whatever was passing overhead. When the expected moment came and passed without catastrophe, confusion spread faster than relief. The monster seemed to vanish from every radar, every telescope, every instrument trained upon its coordinates. Where there had been a persistent anomaly, there was now only empty space, or rather, space that appeared empty to our limited means of perception. In the control room of the Very Large Array in New Mexico, a senior astronomer stared at her screens in disbelief. "It's gone," she whispered, though whether in disappointment or relief no one could tell. The room erupted in questions. Had it changed course? Had it somehow masked itself completely? Had it ever been there at all? The data showed nothing where moments before there had been the unmistakable signature of something massive and unidentifiable. The absence of disaster only deepened the mystery. Did the monster change course at the last moment? Did it enter another dimension, slipping between the layers of reality like a fish beneath the surface of a pond? Or was it never truly physical at all, perhaps a projection, a hologram, a test of some kind? The questions multiplied, each speculation leading to further uncertainties rather than answers. A theoretical physicist at Princeton suggested the monster might have entered a state of quantum superposition, existing in multiple positions simultaneously, effectively spreading itself so thin across probabilistic space that it became undetectable to instruments calibrated to measure objects with defined locations. Others argued this was impossible for something of its size, that quantum effects couldn't scale to cosmic dimensions. The debate raged through academic circles, each expert certain their framework could explain the inexplicable. In the weeks that followed, scientists discovered a new anomaly that challenged everything they thought they understood about the monster's visit. Gravitational wave detectors around the world began registering ripples moving outward from Earth, not toward it. This implied that something massive had interacted with our planet, gently, invisibly, like a hand passing through water without disturbing the surface. The LIGO facility in Washington state recorded these ripples with unprecedented clarity. Unlike the gravitational waves produced by colliding black holes or neutron stars, violent events that create sharp, distinctive patterns, these were subtle, almost musical in their rhythmic complexity. They radiated outward from Earth in perfect concentric spheres, as if our planet had become a stone dropped into a cosmic pond. The files describing these findings were quickly sealed under national security directives in multiple countries, deemed too sensitive for public knowledge. But as always happens in the age of information, fragments leaked, enough to suggest that Earth had been touched by something beyond human comprehension, that we had been visited in ways our instruments could barely detect. A graduate student at Berkeley, working with the leaked data, created a three-dimensional model of the gravitational ripples. When rendered as sound, with each variation in frequency represented as a different musical note, the result was hauntingly beautiful. A composition that seemed to combine elements of Bach's mathematical precision with the emotional resonance of whale songs and the rhythmic complexity of rainforest soundscapes. Those who listened to it reported a strange sense of recognition, as if they were hearing something they had always known but somehow forgotten. Was this intentional, a message encoded in the fabric of space-time itself? Or was it simply the natural expression of the monster's existence, the way a stone's properties determine how it will disturb water when dropped? Perhaps the distinction between intentional communication and natural expression doesn't apply to whatever the monster was. Perhaps, at its level of existence, being and communicating are the same thing. Audio engineers analyzing ionospheric recordings in the weeks following. The monster's disappearance found something even more extraordinary. Faint echoes resembling speech, embedded within the same frequency range as the earlier radio bursts. It was as if Earth's atmosphere itself was resonating with the memory of what had passed by, holding the vibrations like a bell long after it has been struck. These atmospheric echoes were strongest at dawn and dusk, those liminal times when the world transitions between states. Researchers at the Arecibo Observatory in Puerto Rico set up specialized equipment, to capture these echoes in their purest form, filtering out human-generated noise and natural atmospheric phenomena. What remained were patterns that defied conventional analysis, neither random nor fully structured, existing in a middle state that seemed to embody both order and chaos simultaneously. Whether these echoes were coincidence or contact remained unverified, but many listeners described them as beautiful, almost mournful, a lament or a lullaby, a farewell or a promise to return. Some claimed to hear patterns that reminded them of whale songs, others of wind through ancient stone structures. Whatever their origin, the sounds created a profound emotional response in those who heard them, a resonance that seemed to bypass the intellectual centers of the brain and connect directly with deeper, more primal aspects of consciousness. A neurologist at Johns Hopkins conducted a study with volunteers who listened to recordings of the echoes while undergoing functional MRI scans. The results were unprecedented. Brain activity patterns that showed simultaneous activation in regions normally associated with language processing, emotional response, spatial awareness, and even dream states. It was as if the sounds were engaging the entire brain at once, creating new neural pathways between areas that rarely communicated with each other. Several subjects reported spontaneous memories during the listening sessions, not of specific events but of sensations, the feeling of floating in water, of flying in dreams, of the moment just before sleep claims consciousness. One described it as remembering something that hasn't happened yet, a phrase that made little logical sense but resonated with many who had experienced the echoes themselves. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the monster's visit was more subtle than any physical evidence. Something in human awareness seemed to shift in the months that followed. People worldwide reported more vivid dreams, often featuring similar imagery, vast spaces, gentle lights, a sense of being observed but not threatened. Animals exhibited unusual behaviors, sometimes gathering in formations that had no explanation in their normal social patterns. In the Serengeti, herds of wildebeest and zebra formed perfect circles under the full moon, standing motionless for hours before dispersing with the dawn. In the Pacific, pods of different whale species congregated in unprecedented numbers, their songs recorded by marine biologists who noted new vocalizations never before documented. Migratory birds altered their routes, converging on locations with no obvious ecological significance before continuing their journeys. Were these responses to some lingering influence the monster had left behind? Were they reacting to changes in the Earth's magnetic field, to subtle alterations in atmospheric chemistry, to ripples in gravitational waves that only their bodies could sense? Or was something deeper occurring, a shift in the relationship between consciousness and reality that affected all living things, not just humans? Electromagnetic sensitivity became a commonly reported phenomenon, with individuals claiming to feel subtle energies they had never noticed before. Some described it as a heightened awareness of electrical devices, knowing when a phone was about to ring, sensing the difference between active and dormant appliances even with their eyes closed. Others spoke of more esoteric perceptions, the ability to feel weather changes hours before they occurred, to sense the emotions of others at a distance, to perceive patterns in seemingly random events. Scientific studies of these claims produced inconclusive results. Some subjects showed measurable differences in brainwave activity when exposed to electromagnetic fields. Others demonstrated no unusual sensitivity in controlled tests. The phenomenon resisted consistent verification, existing in a gray area between confirmed observation and anecdotal report, much like the monster itself. Children born after the monster's visit seemed to possess unusual abilities to connect with each other non-verbally, to understand concepts beyond their years, to see patterns adults missed. Pediatric researchers noted statistical anomalies in developmental tests, higher scores in spatial reasoning, pattern recognition, and empathic response compared to historical averages. These differences were subtle but consistent across cultural and geographical boundaries. A kindergarten teacher in Kyoto documented her students spontaneously arranging themselves in geometric patterns during play, creating structures with blocks that exhibited surprising mathematical properties, drawing pictures that contained recurring motifs similar to those observed in the polar light displays during the monster's approach. When interviewed, the children couldn't explain their choices. They simply said it felt right or looked pretty. Was the monster not a creature or craft at all, but an event? A consciousness passing through our reality, leaving ripples in its wake? Did it come to observe, to study, to communicate, or simply to experience? And did it change us merely by the act of observation, the way quantum particles change their behavior when witnessed? The quantum physics analogy runs deeper than it might first appear. In the famous double-slit experiment, electrons behave differently depending on whether they are being observed, acting as particles when measured, as waves when not. The mere act of observation changes the reality being observed. Perhaps the monster's visit was less about what it did than about what it witnessed. Its consciousness somehow entangling with our own, changing both in the process. Now, months after that first timestamp at 02:37 a.m., nights feel different. The stars seem closer somehow, the silence between them heavier with meaning. Those who look up feel something new, not fear, not even wonder, but recognition. As if the monster's approach, whether real or imagined, reminded humanity of something it had long forgotten, that we are part of a larger conversation, a cosmic dialogue that has been ongoing since the first stars ignited. A poet in Barcelona captured this sensation in a verse that went viral. Translated into dozens of languages and shared across continents, the stars no longer wait for our attention. They have remembered we are here. The simplicity of the line belied its impact. It seemed to articulate something millions were feeling but couldn't express, a subtle shift in humanity's relationship with the cosmos. The monster's legacy lingers, invisible but unforgettable. It whispers in the static between radio stations, in the pause between heartbeats, in the moment before sleep claims consciousness. It reminds us that reality is vaster and stranger than our instruments can measure, that science is not the end of mystery, but its beginning. In universities around the world, new interdisciplinary fields emerged, combining astrophysics with consciousness studies, quantum mechanics with anthropology. The rigid boundaries between scientific disciplines began to dissolve as researchers recognized that the monster's visit couldn't be understood through any single framework. It required a synthesis of perspectives, a new way of knowing that honored both objective measurement and subjective experience. A professor of comparative religion at Oxford published a paper noting the similarities between accounts of the monsters, effects, and mystical experiences described in traditions ranging from Sufism to Zen Buddhism to indigenous shamanic practices. The parallels were striking. The sense of dissolving boundaries between self and other, the perception of time as non-linear, the ineffable quality that resisted direct description. Was the monster somehow activating these latent capacities in human consciousness, or were these experiences simply how our minds processed contact with something beyond our evolved categories of understanding? Somewhere in the darkness, beyond the limits of our telescopes, perhaps the monster watches still. Perhaps it always has. Or perhaps it simply came to remind us that we are not alone, before drifting silently back into the void, leaving us forever changed by its passing. A theoretical physicist in Mumbai suggested that the monster might exist primarily in dimensions beyond the three spatial dimensions and one-time dimension we directly experience. In this model, what we perceived as the monster was merely a shadow of a much more complex entity, like how a three-dimensional object casts a two-dimensional shadow on a wall. This would explain its seemingly impossible properties, its ability to appear and disappear, its capacity to affect reality in ways that defied our physics. If this is true, then the monster never truly left. It simply moved in directions we cannot perceive, remaining present but invisible, like a hand lifted from the surface of a pond while still existing in the air above. This theory brought comfort to some and unease to others. The idea that we are constantly surrounded by realities we cannot perceive, by consciousnesses that might be watching us from dimensions we cannot access, challenges our sense of privacy, of autonomy, of being the primary agents in our own story. What does it mean to be visited? To be seen? To be found among the countless worlds spinning in the darkness? Perhaps the monster came not to study us, but to awaken us, to shake us from the comfortable illusion that we understand our place in the cosmos, that we know what is and isn't possible. In the aftermath of its passing, humanity found itself in a state of collective liminality, no longer what we were before, not yet what we might become. Like adolescents caught between childhood and adulthood, we experience the growing pains of an expanded awareness, the disorientation of seeing ourselves from a new perspective. The certainties that had anchored us now seemed provisional, the boundaries we had taken for granted revealed as permeable. This uncertainty expressed itself differently across cultures and individuals. Some retreated into dogmatic assertions of human uniqueness, clinging to religious or philosophical frameworks that placed humanity at the center of creation. Others embraced the vertigo of cosmic insignificance, finding paradoxical comfort in the dissolution of human exceptionalism. Most found themselves somewhere in between, holding contradictory feelings simultaneously, both special and ordinary, both central and peripheral to the universe's unfolding story. The questions the monster left behind are more valuable than answers could ever be. They open doors in human consciousness, create new pathways of thought, inspire generations of seekers to look beyond the boundaries of the known. In this way, the monster's gift was not revelation but mystery, the greatest catalyst for human evolution. Consider how many great discoveries began with anomalies, with data that shouldn't exist, with observations that defied explanation, the orbit of Mercury that Einstein explained with relativity, the cosmic microwave background radiation that confirmed the Big Bang, the precession of the equinoxes that led ancient astronomers to realize Earth wobbles on its axis. The monster may be the greatest anomaly yet encountered, a challenge not just to our scientific understanding, but to our conception of what it means to be conscious in a universe that may be teeming with forms of awareness we cannot yet comprehend. A philosopher at the Sorbonne proposed that the monster might represent not an individual entity but a collective consciousness, a composite being, comprised of many consciousnesses acting in perfect harmony, similar to how a human body consists of trillions of cells working together. This would explain its seemingly contradictory properties, its ability to be both singular and distributed, its capacity for complexity beyond what any individual intelligence might achieve. This perspective resonated with many who had experienced the monster's effects directly. They described a sense of multiplicity within unity, of being in the presence of something both singular and plural. It felt like talking to a forest, one witness said, where each tree is distinct, but also part of a greater whole. This description echoed indigenous wisdom traditions that have long recognized consciousness in natural systems, in forests, rivers, mountains, not as metaphor but as literal truth. In observatories around the world, astronomers continue their nightly vigil, scanning the skies with new purpose. The search for extraterrestrial intelligence has been transformed, no longer a hopeful reaching out into the void, but a response to what has already reached toward us. The question is no longer are we alone, but who else is here? The algorithms used to detect potential signals have been revised, expanded to look for patterns similar to those associated with the monster. The narrow focus on radio waves has broadened to include gravitational distortions, quantum fluctuations, patterns in cosmic ray distribution, phenomena once considered too chaotic or too subtle to contain information. Scientists now understand that communication might occur through channels we hadn't previously recognized as capable of carrying meaning. Some nights, when the air is still and the stars particularly bright, those who witnessed the monster's passage swear they can feel it still, a presence just beyond perception, a whisper almost heard, a shadow at the corner of vision, not a haunting but a heightening, an expansion of the senses to include what was previously filtered out. A neuroscientist at the University of California hypothesized that the monster might have affected the filtering mechanisms in the human brain, those processes that normally screen out the vast majority of sensory information to prevent overwhelming our conscious awareness. Perhaps the monster somehow recalibrated these filters, allowing us to perceive more of what has always been present, but ignored by our selective attention. This would explain the reports of increased sensitivity, of heightened awareness, of subtle perceptions that previously went unnoticed. It wasn't that something new had been added to human experience, but that something previously excluded had been allowed in, like adjusting the aperture on a camera to admit more light, revealing details that were always present but hidden in shadow. Perhaps this is the monster's true nature, not an entity but a perspective, a way of perceiving that it shared with us briefly, changing the frequency of human consciousness like a tuning fork adjusting an instrument. Perhaps it came not from distant space, but from the spaces between our thoughts, the quantum foam underlying reality itself. A mathematician at MIT developed a model suggesting that consciousness itself might be a fundamental property of the universe, like mass or charge, present to some degree in all systems, but expressed differently depending on complexity and organization. In this framework, the monster represented not an alien consciousness, but a different expression of the same consciousness that manifests in humans, in dolphins, in forests, in galaxies, a different note in the same cosmic symphony. This perspective offers a profound shift in how we understand our relationship with the cosmos. If consciousness is fundamental rather than emergent, if it exists in varying forms and intensities throughout reality rather than being confined to certain biological systems, then we are never truly alone. The universe is not dead matter occasionally interrupted by islands of awareness, but awareness itself manifesting in countless forms, including but not limited to what we recognize as life. What would it mean if the monster were not alien but deeply familiar, a reflection of consciousness itself, a mirror held up to humanity's collective mind? What if it showed us not what's out there but what's in here, the vast uncharted territories of our own awareness that we've only begun to explore? A poet and quantum physicist collaboration in Copenhagen published a series of dialogues exploring this possibility. They proposed that the monster might be a projection of humanity's collective unconscious, not in a metaphorical sense, but literally, a psychic energy so powerful it manifested physically, creating gravitational and electromagnetic effects through mechanisms science has yet to discover. This wasn't presented as fact, but as a thought experiment, an invitation to consider how the boundaries between mind and matter might be more permeable than we've assumed. There are those who believe the monster will return, that its first approach was merely reconnaissance, preparation for a more profound contact. Others think it never left at all but simply changed its relationship to our perception, becoming invisible by inhabiting a frequency we haven't yet learned to tune into consistently. A small community in the mountains of Peru claims to have maintained contact with the monster through meditative practices. They gather at dawn and dusk, those transitional moments when the atmospheric echoes are strongest, and enter collective states of consciousness they describe as listening with the whole body. The experiences they report are remarkably consistent, sensations of vastness, of multiple perspectives simultaneously, of time expanding and contracting like a breathing. Lung scientific investigators who have studied this community note measurable changes in their brainwave patterns during these sessions, unusual synchronization across participants, increased coherence between normally distinct neural networks, activity in regions typically dormant during normal waking consciousness. Whether they are truly communicating with the monster or accessing something else entirely remains unclear, but something significant is happening, something that challenges our understanding of both brain function and the boundaries of individual consciousness. The governments of Earth maintain their silence, neither confirming nor denying what transpired during those strange days. Perhaps they know more than they've shared, perhaps they know less than they fear, but their silence speaks volumes about how unprepared our institutions are for contact with something truly other, something that doesn't fit into our categories of friend or foe, threat or opportunity. A former intelligence analyst, speaking anonymously, suggested that world governments were as bewildered by the monster as everyone else, that their silence stemmed not from knowledge but from its absence, from the institutional inability to acknowledge phenomena that couldn't be classified within existing frameworks of understanding. The system isn't designed to say we don't know, she explained. It's designed to project certainty, control, mastery. The monster revealed how illusory that mastery is, and that's more threatening to institutional power than any physical danger could be. In the absence of official guidance, humanity has begun to create its own meaning from the monster's visit. New spiritual movements have emerged, centered around the idea of cosmic connection. Scientific disciplines have expanded to include the study of anomalous phenomena, once dismissed as fringe. Art and literature explore themes of contact, transformation, and the permeability of boundaries between self and other. The monster, whatever it was, has become a catalyst, a stimulus for human evolution not through direct intervention, but through the questions it inspired, the boundaries it dissolved, the possibilities it revealed. Like the monolith in a famous science fiction film, its mere presence changed the trajectory of our development. Children born after the monster's passage seem especially attuned to its legacy. They speak of dreams where they travel among the stars, where distance is meaningless and time flows differently. They draw pictures of lights and shadows that match no known celestial objects. They ask questions that leave adults speechless, not because they're unanswerable, but because they've never been asked. Before, at a kindergarten teacher in Auckland, documented conversations among her 5-year-old students that included sophisticated concepts from quantum physics, discussions of multiple dimensions, of time as a spatial dimension, of consciousness as a field rather than a localized phenomenon. When asked where they learned such ideas, the children seemed confused by the question. "Nobody taught us," one said. "It's just how things are." Is it possible that the monster's most lasting impact will be on generations not yet mature enough to analyze it scientifically? That its message, if there was one, was planted like a seed in the fertile ground of young minds unconstrained by existing paradigms. A developmental psychologist at the University of Tokyo has begun a longitudinal study of children born within a year of the monster's visit, tracking their cognitive development, their perceptual abilities, their ways of relating to the world. Early results suggest subtle but significant differences from historical norms: greater empathic accuracy, more fluid conceptual boundaries, increased comfort with paradox and ambiguity. Whether these differences represent a lasting evolutionary shift or a temporary cultural effect remains to be seen. Time will tell. The universe unfolds at its own pace, reveals its secrets according to its own schedule. The monster's approach began with a timestamp, 02:37 a.m. somewhere over the Pacific, but its effects may not be fully understood for centuries. Great shifts in human understanding rarely announce themselves as such. They seep gradually into consciousness, changing how we see everything else. An archival researcher working with historical documents found intriguing parallels between the monster's visit and accounts from various points in human history: medieval chronicles describing ships in the sky, Renaissance reports of celestial wonders, indigenous oral histories of star beings who came to Earth. Were these earlier visitations by the monster, or something like it? Has it been checking on us periodically throughout our development, watching and perhaps subtly guiding our evolution? The possibility that we have never been alone, that our cosmic visitors have been with us all along, challenges both scientific materialism and religious exclusivism. It suggests a history of humanity that is both more connected and more mysterious than either framework allows, a story in which we are neither the accidental products of blind physical processes, nor the special creation of a personal deity, but participants in a cosmic ecology of consciousness that we are only beginning to glimpse. As for those who first witnessed the anomaly, who tracked its impossible movements across the sky, who felt the weight of knowledge too vast to share fully with the world, they carry a particular burden. To have been among the first to know, to have seen the data that shouldn't exist, is to be forever changed. They look at the night sky differently now, with both greater knowledge and greater humility. The astronomer who first noticed the anomaly at 02:37 a.m. rarely speaks publicly about her experience. When pressed in a rare interview, she said only, "Before I thought I was studying the stars. Now I understand the stars are studying us." This cryptic statement has been interpreted in many ways as a poetic metaphor, as evidence of psychological impact, as a hint toward some deeper truth she cannot express directly. Perhaps that's what the monster came to teach us. In the end, not facts about itself, but a new relationship with mystery. A comfort with not knowing that paradoxically opens up new avenues of discovery. A recognition that the universe is not only stranger than we imagine, but stranger than we can imagine. And that this strangeness is not something to fear, but something to embrace. A philosopher in Alexandria wrote that The monster represented the return of the numinous, that sense of awe and wonder in the face of mystery that modern rationalism had tried to eliminate. "We convinced ourselves we were approaching complete understanding," he wrote. "The monster reminded us how far we are from it, and how beautiful that distance is, how filled with possibility. The stars continue their ancient patterns overhead, but now they seem less like distant lights and more like windows, apertures through which something might be looking back at us, watching our response to the brief unveiling of a greater reality than we had previously perceived." In that moment at 02:37 a.m., when the observatory's data feed began to flicker, humanity crossed a threshold. Whether we met another intelligence or simply encountered a natural phenomenon beyond our understanding doesn't matter as much as the fact that our conception of what's possible expanded irreversibly. The monster, if it was ever truly there, has become part of us now. A story we tell ourselves about who we are and what might be out there, a question that lives in the silence between heartbeats, a shadow that gives definition to the light of human consciousness. And somewhere in the vast darkness beyond our atmosphere, perhaps it continues its journey, or perhaps it watches, waiting for the moment when we're ready for more than a passing encounter, when we can sustain the full weight of contact with something truly other, without breaking under the strain of its implications. Until then, we look up at the night sky with new eyes, eyes that have glimpsed, however briefly, the true vastness of the cosmos and our place within it. Eyes that know the stars are not just distant suns, but waypoints in a universe teeming with possibilities we're only beginning to imagine. Eyes that have been opened by the monster's gentle touch and can never fully close. Again, the ionosphere, that delicate membrane where our atmosphere meets space, began to shimmer, with new patterns in the months after the monster's passing. Researchers at the High-Frequency Active Auroral Research Program facility in Alaska documented unusual resonance patterns that seemed to cycle through mathematical progressions, like ripples expanding from multiple stones dropped in the same pond. These weren't random disturbances, but structured oscillations that suggested purpose, design, intelligence. A physicist specializing in atmospheric phenomena described it as the afterimage of something, fast moving through dimensions we can only partially perceive. She compared it to how a ship passing through water leaves a wake that continues long after the vessel itself has disappeared over the horizon. What we're seeing, she suggested, might be the wake of something that traveled not just through space, but through the fabric of reality itself. Consider what happens when a profound idea enters your mind, how it reshapes your thoughts, alters your perception, changes the way you interpret everything that follows. Now imagine an idea so vast it enters not an individual mind, but the collective consciousness of an entire planet. The monster may have been such an idea, made manifest through means we lack the vocabulary to describe. The dreams came first, vivid, luminous visions that seemed more real than waking life. People across cultural and geographic boundaries reported similar experiences, floating in vast expanses of darkness punctuated by gentle lights, sensing a presence that observed without judgment, feeling connections to consciousnesses both familiar and utterly alien. These weren't the chaotic assemblages typical of human dreams, but coherent experiences that left the dreamers changed, as if they had actually traveled somewhere and returned. A sleep researcher in Stockholm conducted a study using EEG monitors on volunteers, who reported these monster dreams. The brain activity patterns she recorded defied conventional understanding, simultaneous activation in regions that normally function independently, coherent theta waves across both hemispheres, and most surprisingly, synchronized patterns between different subjects sleeping in isolated rooms. It was as if their dreaming minds were participating in the same experience, sharing the same mental space despite their physical separation. "We're seeing evidence of a field effect," she wrote in her controversial paper, later withdrawn from publication under mysterious circumstances. Something is connecting these individuals at a level deeper than physical proximity, allowing them to share subjective experiences in a way that challenges our understanding of consciousness as isolated to individual brains. The children born during and after the monster's passage showed the most profound effects. Pediatricians around the world noted unusual developmental patterns, accelerated neurological growth, enhanced pattern recognition abilities, and a form of intuitive understanding that manifested before language acquisition. These children seemed to communicate with each other through means that baffled their parents and caregivers, exchanging complex concepts without words, coordinating activities without visible signals. At a preschool in Montreal, teachers observed a group of 3-year-olds spontaneously arranging themselves in formations that, when viewed from above, resembled the same mathematical progressions observed in the ionospheric disturbances. When asked what they were doing, one child responded simply, "We're listening to the sky." Another said, "The big quiet one is teaching us how to talk without noise." Their teachers, unsure whether to be amazed or concerned, documented these occurrences with increasing frequency. What does it mean when the youngest among us perceive something the rest of us cannot? Throughout history, children have been credited with special sensitivities, the ability to see fairies, to speak with imaginary friends, to access realms of imagination closed to adult minds. We dismiss these as fantasies, as developmental phases to be outgrown. But what if they represent genuine perceptions, access to aspects of reality that our educated, rational minds have learned to filter out? The monster may have awakened this capacity, not just in children but in adults, whose perceptual filters were temporarily disrupted by its presence. Reports of heightened sensory awareness, of synesthetic experiences where people could hear colors or taste sounds, proliferated in the months following its visit. Many described a dissolution of boundaries between self and environment, a sense that consciousness extended beyond the confines of their bodies to include the air they breathed, the ground beneath their feet, the stars overhead. A neurologist at the University of California proposed that the monster might have triggered a shift in default mode network activity in the human brain, that constellation of neural regions active when the mind is at rest, wandering, reflecting on itself. This network, believed to generate our sense of self, our autobiographical identity, our feeling of being separate from what we perceive, showed altered connectivity patterns in subjects who reported profound experiences related to the monster. We may be witnessing an evolutionary leap in human consciousness, she suggested, not through genetic mutation, but through direct informational transfer, as if the monster somehow updated our neural architecture through its interaction with Earth's electromagnetic field, which in turn affects the electromagnetic activity of our brains. This hypothesis remains controversial, dismissed by many as speculative overreach, yet it offers a framework for understanding phenomena that otherwise defy explanation. How people separated by thousands of miles could share identical experiences. How children born after the monster's passage could demonstrate abilities their parents lack. How the entire fabric of human perception seems subtly but permanently altered by an event that left no physical trace. The arts underwent a renaissance in the aftermath, with creators across all media reporting unprecedented inspiration, as if channels to something larger had suddenly opened. Musicians composed works of extraordinary complexity that nonetheless felt intuitive, accessible, deeply moving. Painters created canvases filled with structures and color combinations never before seen, yet somehow familiar to viewers who felt a shock of recognition upon seeing them. A composer in Prague created a symphony based on the mathematical relationships found in the monster's radio emissions. When performed, audience members reported experiences ranging from mild visual hallucinations to profound alterations in their sense of time and space. Some claimed to have received specific information during the performance, solutions to scientific problems they had been struggling with, insights into personal dilemmas, visions of possible futures that felt more like memories than predictions. The music isn't creating these experiences, the composer insisted when questioned. It's merely tuning the listener to frequencies that have always been present, but usually go unheard. I didn't invent these patterns. I discovered them. They were always there, waiting for someone to give them voice. What do we make of such claims? Are they evidence of genuine contact with something beyond ordinary human experience? Or are they the natural psychological response to an event that challenged our fundamental understanding of reality? Perhaps the distinction itself is a false dichotomy, a product of dualistic thinking that the monster's visit has rendered obsolete. In universities and research institutions, new disciplines emerged at the intersection of established fields: quantum biology, consciousness studies, non-local information theory. The rigid boundaries between physics and psychology, between objective measurement and subjective experience, began to dissolve as scientists recognized that understanding the monster required approaches that honored both the measurable and the meaningful aspects of its interaction with Earth. A physicist and a philosopher at Princeton collaborated on a paper suggesting that consciousness itself might be a fundamental property of the universe, like mass or charge, expressed differently at different levels of complexity. In this framework, the monster represented not an alien intelligence, but a different expression of the same consciousness that manifests in humans. In dolphins, in forests, in galaxies, a different note in the same cosmic chord. What we experienced as the monster, they wrote, may have experienced us as well, perceiving humanity as a single entity rather than billions of individuals, just as we perceive a forest as a unified ecosystem rather than trillions of separate cells. The interaction between these different expressions of consciousness, human and other, may have created a resonance that continues to reverberate through both. This perspective offers a profound shift in how we understand our relationship with the cosmos. If consciousness is fundamental rather than emergent, if it exists in varying forms throughout reality rather than being confined to certain biological systems, then we are never truly alone. The universe is not dead matter occasionally interrupted by islands of awareness, but awareness itself manifesting in countless forms, including but not limited to what we recognize as life. Religious and spiritual traditions found both challenge and validation in the monster's visit. Some saw it as confirmation of ancient beliefs about beings from the stars who influenced human development. Others interpreted it through eschatological frameworks as a sign of impending cosmic transformation. New movements emerged, synthesizing elements from various traditions, with the direct experiences catalyzed by the monster's presence. A theological scholar at the University of Cairo noted striking parallels between accounts of the monster's effects and mystical experiences described in Sufi, Buddhist, and indigenous shamanic practices. The dissolution of self, the sense of cosmic interconnection, the perception of reality as simultaneously empty and infinitely full. These are the hallmarks of mystical experience across cultures and throughout history, he observed. What's unprecedented is not the nature of these experiences, but their sudden availability to people with no prior spiritual practice or framework. This democratization of mystical experience, its emergence, in ordinary people going about their daily lives, represents perhaps the most profound aspect of the monster's legacy. Experiences once accessible only through years of meditation, prayer, or ceremonial practice suddenly became available to anyone whose perceptual filters had been adjusted by the monster's passing. The implications for human culture, for our understanding of consciousness itself, are still unfolding. In remote regions where indigenous knowledge traditions remained intact, elders spoke of the monster not as something new, but as something returning, a consciousness that had interacted with Earth and its inhabitants many times throughout history, appearing differently in each era, according to the perceptual and conceptual frameworks available. They pointed to ancient stories of sky beings, of teachers from the stars, of times when the boundary between worlds grew thin and humans could perceive what normally remains hidden. Our ancestors knew them, said an elder from a small community in the Amazon basin. They come when change is needed, when humanity has reached a point where it must either transform or perish. They do not control this transformation. They simply remind us it is possible, that we are more than we believe ourselves to be. This perspective suggests the monster may be part of Earth's developmental ecology, a catalyst for evolutionary leaps in consciousness that appears when conditions are ripe, like a mycorrhizal network that connects separate plants into a communal system, facilitating exchange of nutrients and information. Perhaps what we perceived as a visitor from beyond was actually a long-term participant in Earth's unfolding story, returning at a critical juncture to facilitate our next step. Some speculate that previous mass extinction events, rather than being solely catastrophic, may have created evolutionary openings that allowed new forms of consciousness to emerge. The dinosaurs' disappearance made way for mammals. Perhaps current planetary challenges, climate change, biodiversity loss, resource depletion, are creating conditions for another evolutionary leap, not in physical form this time, but in awareness itself. The monster may be both harbinger and midwife of this transformation. In the realm of quantum physics, researchers exploring non-locality, the phenomenon whereby particles separated by vast distances can instantaneously affect each other, began to consider whether consciousness might operate according to similar principles. If particles can remain entangled across space and time, might conscious entities also exist in states of entanglement, creating connections that transcend ordinary physical limitations? A theoretical physicist at the Institute for Advanced Study proposed that the monster might exist primarily in dimensions beyond the 3 spatial dimensions and 1 time dimension we directly experience. In this model, what we perceived as the monster was merely a shadow of a much more complex entity, like how a 3-dimensional object casts a 2-dimensional shadow on a wall. This would explain its seemingly impossible properties, its ability to appear and disappear, its capacity to affect reality in ways that defied our physics. Imagine a 4-dimensional hand passing through a 3-dimensional space, she explained. The inhabitants of that space would perceive only a series of disconnected cross-sections, first fingertips appearing from nowhere, then circular sections of fingers, then a flat oval representing the palm, all changing shape as the hand moved through their reality. Similarly, what we perceived as the monster may have been cross-sections of a higher dimensional entity passing through our limited perceptual framework. If this is true, then the monster never truly left. It simply moved in directions we cannot directly perceive, remaining present but invisible, like a hand lifted from the surface of a pond while still existing in the air above. This theory brought comfort to some and unease to others. The idea that we are constantly surrounded by realities we cannot perceive, by consciousnesses that might be watching us from dimensions we cannot access, challenges our sense of privacy, of autonomy, of being the primary agents in our own story. Yet it also offers a profound expansion of possibility. If reality is vaster than our ordinary perception reveals, if consciousness can exist in forms we haven't yet recognized, then the universe is far richer, more alive, more filled with potential than we had imagined. The monster's gift may be precisely this revelation, not information about itself, but a window into the limitless nature of what exists, of what we might become. In the aftermath of its passing, humanity found itself in a state of collective liminality, no longer what we were before, not yet what we might become. Like adolescents caught between childhood and adulthood, we experience the growing pains of an expanded awareness, the disorientation of seeing ourselves from a new perspective. The certainties that had anchored us now seemed provisional. The boundaries we had taken for granted revealed as permeable. A cultural anthropologist observed that societies throughout history have developed rituals to navigate such liminal periods, ceremonies that acknowledge the dissolution of old identities and facilitate the emergence of new ones. Yet no existing ritual framework seemed adequate to process the planetary-scale transition catalyzed by the monster's visit. In the absence of established pathways, people began creating their own rituals, gathering in groups to share experiences, to make sense of what had happened, to integrate the new awareness into their understanding of themselves and their world. These gatherings occurred spontaneously across cultures, in urban parks and rural fields, in living rooms and online forums, in scientific conferences and religious ceremonies. Despite their diverse contexts, they shared common elements, periods of silence, sharing of dreams and visions, creative expressions through music and movement, and a quality of deep listening that participants described as hearing with the whole body. Through these emergent rituals, a new kind of human community began to form, one based not on shared beliefs or identities, but on shared experience of the ineffable. A sociologist noted that conflicts over resources, territory and ideology, the drivers of human warfare throughout history, seemed subtly altered in the wake of the monster's passing. It's not that these conflicts disappeared, she wrote, but that they're increasingly viewed through a wider lens. When you've glimpsed even briefly the vastness of cosmic time and space, when you've sensed the fundamental interconnection of all consciousness, it becomes harder to maintain the illusions of separateness and scarcity that fuel most human conflict. This shift manifested in unexpected places, in corporate boardrooms where executives began incorporating ecological concerns into business models, in military briefings where officers questioned the logic of nationalist competition, in religious institutions where leaders from different traditions found common ground in the shared mystery they had all glimpsed. The change wasn't universal or complete, but it was significant enough to alter trajectories that had seemed fixed and inevitable. Perhaps most profoundly, the monster's visit catalyzed a shift in humanity's relationship with time. The frenetic pace of modern life, always accelerating, always oriented toward a future that never arrives, gave way in many to a more spacious temporal awareness, an appreciation for depth rather than speed, for presence rather than progress. People reported experiencing moments of time dilation, when seconds stretched into eternities filled with detail and meaning, when the artificial boundaries between past, present, and future temporarily dissolved. Philosopher described this as vertical time, as opposed to the horizontal time of ordinary experience, a dimension of temporal depth that exists within each moment, rather than extending in a linear sequence. In vertical time, she wrote, everything is simultaneously present. The past isn't left behind. The future isn't yet to come. All possibilities, all actualities exist in a state of superposition, just as quantum particles exist in multiple states until observed. This altered temporal awareness affected not just individual experience, but collective decision-making. Environmental policies began to consider impacts centuries ahead. Cultural preservation efforts recognized the presence of the past in shaping current identity. Education systems incorporated contemplative practices that cultivated this expanded temporal perspective. The short-term thinking that had characterized much of modern civilization began to give way to what some called deep time consciousness, an awareness that recognized each present moment as embedded in cosmic scales of time. Artists became the primary cartographers of this new territory, creating works that mapped aspects of experience for which we had no previous reference points. A filmmaker in Lagos created a documentary that used no words, only carefully composed images and sounds that evoked the presence of the monster more effectively than any verbal description could. Viewers reported that watching it recreated the sense of contact many had experienced during the monster's actual visit. That ineffable feeling of being in the presence of something vast yet intimate, alien yet deeply familiar. I'm not documenting the monster, the filmmaker explained. I'm documenting what happens to human perception when it encounters something that transcends its categories. The monster itself may be beyond representation, but its effect on consciousness can be shared, transmitted, kept alive through art. This understanding of art as a technology for transmitting states of consciousness, rather than merely representing objects or ideas, marked a return to its original shamanic function, a means of accessing and sharing realities beyond ordinary perception. Museums and galleries became sites of transformation rather than just appreciation, places where people went not to observe aesthetics, but to undergo experiences that changed how they perceived everything else. Children continued to demonstrate the most pronounced effects, their young minds not yet solidified into fixed patterns of perception and interpretation. Schools struggled to adapt to these new capacities, their standardized curricula and assessment methods increasingly irrelevant to students who could access information and understanding through means that bypassed conventional learning processes. A teacher in a rural Japanese elementary school described watching her 6-year-old students solve complex mathematical problems without using standard algorithms, their solutions emerging through what appeared to be direct intuitive grasp of numerical relationships. When asked how they knew the answers, the children seemed puzzled by the question. The numbers tell us, one explained. They show us how they want to dance together. Similar phenomena appeared in language acquisition, artistic expression, and social dynamics. Children demonstrated abilities that seemed to transcend the normal developmental timeline, not because they were advancing more quickly through established stages, but because they were following entirely different developmental pathways. They weren't faster versions of previous generations. They were something new, their consciousness structured according to principles catalyzed by the monster's interaction with Earth's noosphere. What emerged was not a uniform advancement but a diversification of human potential, new cognitive modalities appearing alongside existing ones, creating a spectrum of consciousness far wider than had previously existed within our species. Some children developed extraordinary empathic abilities, sensing others' emotions with uncanny accuracy. Others showed heightened pattern recognition across disparate domains. Still others manifested forms of awareness for which we have no established vocabulary, perceiving aspects of reality previously invisible to human consciousness. The educational philosopher Ken Robinson had once said, "If you're not prepared to be wrong, you'll never come up with anything original." In the post-monster world, this principle extended beyond creativity to basic epistemology. Being prepared to be wrong, to have one's entire framework of understanding transformed, became not just a creative stance, but a survival skill in a reality revealed to be far more fluid, more filled with possibility than we had previously recognized. Scientists found themselves in a particularly challenging position, their commitment to empirical evidence and repeatable experiments strained by phenomena that seemed to shift depending on who was observing them, that refused to manifest under the controlled conditions of laboratory settings. Those who rigidly maintained pre-monster paradigms found themselves increasingly isolated, their research programs yielding diminishing returns. Those who embraced the new uncertainty, who developed methodologies that honored both objective measurement and subjective experience, made the most significant breakthroughs. A new approach emerged at the boundary between science and mysticism, drawing on both empirical rigor and contemplative insight. Researchers trained not only in quantitative methods, but in meditative practices, developed protocols for studying consciousness itself, not just its neural correlates, but its fundamental nature, its relationship to physical reality, its potential states beyond ordinary human experience. "We're developing a science of the first person," explained the director of a new institute dedicated to consciousness studies, "not to replace third-person objective methods, but to complement them, to create a more complete epistemology that honors both the measurable properties of reality and its felt qualities, its meanings, its values." The monster revealed that these aren't separate domains but aspects of a unified reality that we had artificially divided. This integration of knowing modes represented perhaps the most profound aspect of the monster's legacy, a healing of the split between subject and object, between consciousness and matter, between meaning and mechanism that had characterized Western thought since the Enlightenment. The rigid boundaries between disciplines dissolved as researchers recognized that understanding reality in its fullness required approaches that honored both its quantitative and qualitative dimensions. A cosmologist working at this intersection proposed that consciousness might be an intrinsic aspect of reality at all scales, from subatomic particles to human beings to galaxies. "What varies isn't the presence or absence of consciousness," she suggested, "but its organization, its complexity, its self-reflective capacity." In this framework, the monster might represent not an alien form of consciousness, but a more integrated expression of the same. Consciousness that manifests in us, perhaps even a possible future state of our own evolution. This perspective offers a profound reframing of humanity's place in the cosmos. Rather than isolated sparks of awareness in an otherwise dead universe, we may be expressions of a consciousness that permeates reality at all levels, distinct in our particular configuration, but fundamentally connected to all other manifestations, from the simplest quantum fluctuations to the most complex living systems to structures at cosmic scales we can barely comprehend. If true, this would explain why the monster's passing catalyzed such profound shifts in human awareness. It wasn't introducing something foreign, but awakening capacities already latent within us, activating potentials that were always present but dormant. Like a tuning fork that causes another to vibrate at the same frequency, its presence resonated with aspects of our own nature that had been muted by cultural conditioning, by evolutionary limitations, by the particular configuration of consciousness we had identified as exclusively human. The monster's legacy, then, may be not information about itself, but insight into ourselves, a glimpse of what we might become as we continue to evolve, not just biologically, but consciously. The children born in its wake, with their unusual abilities and perceptions, may represent not an anomaly, but the leading edge of this evolution, scouts venturing into territories of awareness that the rest of humanity will eventually explore. In this light, the lingering effects of the monster's visit, the altered dreams, the heightened perceptions, the subtle shifts in how we relate to time and space and each other, appear not as temporary disruptions, but as harbingers of a new chapter in human development. We are changing, not because something changed us from outside, but because we glimpsed a possibility that was always within us, waiting to be recognized. The most profound revolutions in human history have been revolutions of perception, shifts in how we see ourselves and our place in the larger order. The Copernican revolution moved Earth from the center of the cosmos to one planet among many. Darwin's insights placed humans within the continuity of all life. Einstein's relativity revealed space and time as aspects of a unified fabric, rather than absolute frameworks. Each of these perceptual shifts fundamentally altered how humans understood themselves and their world. The monster may have initiated a comparable revolution, not by providing new information, but by catalyzing a new way of perceiving, a shift in awareness that allows us to recognize what was always present, but previously filtered out by the limitations of our evolutionary and cultural conditioning. This isn't knowledge in the conventional sense, but a change in the knower, in the very structure of knowing itself. A Tibetan Buddhist teacher noted similarities between these experiences and what contemplative traditions have described for millennia. What's happening now, he observed, resembles what dedicated practitioners have achieved through years of meditation, the recognition of emptiness, of interdependence, of consciousness as the ground rather than a product of physical processes. The difference is that it's happening spontaneously, without the scaffolding of tradition, without the context that helps integrate these insights into ordinary life. This lack of context creates both opportunity and challenge. Without established frameworks to interpret their experiences, people must find their own meaning, their own ways of integrating expanded awareness with the practical demands of everyday existence. This can lead to confusion, to psychological destabilization, to what contemplative traditions have called spiritual emergency, a crisis triggered by the rapid dissolution of one's previous identity and worldview. Yet it also allows for fresh approaches, for new syntheses not constrained by existing paradigms. The monster's gift includes not just expanded perception, but the freedom to develop new frameworks for understanding and expressing what we perceive, frameworks not limited by the dualistic thinking that has characterized much of human intellectual history. A neurologist, studying these effects, proposed that the monster may have triggered what she called global neuroplasticity, worldwide increase in the human brain's capacity to reorganize itself, to form new neural connections in response to experience. This biological correlate of perceptual expansion manifested as measurable changes in brain structure and function, particularly in regions associated with self-awareness, empathy, and the integration of information across sensory modalities. We're seeing evidence of massive rewiring, she reported, not uniform across all individuals, but showing clear statistical trends. The post-monster human brain appears more interconnected, more flexible, more capable of processing multiple streams of information simultaneously. These changes are most pronounced in children, but present to some degree across all age groups, suggesting that neuroplasticity remains available throughout the lifespan when stimulated by sufficiently novel input. This biological transformation parallels shifts occurring at social and cultural levels, the dissolution of rigid boundaries between disciplines, between nations, between ideological frameworks. As individual brains become more integrated, human collectives seem to be following suit, developing new forms of collaboration that transcend traditional organizational structures. The Internet, That global neural network created by human technology began to exhibit properties that some compared to emerging consciousness. Information flowed through its nodes in patterns that increasingly resembled thought rather than mere transmission. Ideas evolving, combining, transforming as they moved through the collective mind of networked humanity. Some speculated that the monster had catalyzed not just individual transformation, but the awakening of a planetary consciousness, a new sphere long prophesied by visionaries like Teilhard de Chardin. Whether this emerging collective awareness represents something genuinely new or merely the recognition of what was always present remains an open question. Perhaps, like an optical illusion that suddenly resolves into a coherent image, humanity is simply perceiving a level of interconnection that always existed but remained below the threshold of our notice. The monster's gift may be the perceptual key that unlocked this recognition, allowing us to see ourselves not just as individuals or even as a species, but as a planetary consciousness awakening to its own nature. As we continue to integrate this expanded awareness, to develop languages and frameworks for understanding what the monster revealed, we find ourselves not at an endpoint but at a beginning. The questions it left us with are not problems to be solved, but koans to be lived with, paradoxes that transform the questioner rather than yielding final answers. What does it mean to be human in a universe revealed to be more conscious, more alive, more filled with agency than we had imagined? How do we live with the knowledge that we are both distinct individuals and expressions of a consciousness that extends far beyond our personal boundaries? How do we honor both our uniqueness and our fundamental unity with all that exists? These questions have no fixed answers, only responses that evolve as we evolve, that deepen as our capacity for understanding deepens. The monster's legacy is not a destination, but a journey, an invitation to continue expanding our awareness, to remain open to possibilities beyond our current comprehension, to participate consciously in the unfolding story of a universe coming to know itself through countless forms of awareness, including but not limited to our own. As we look up at the night sky, at the stars that have watched over Earth since long before humans evolved to wonder about them, we feel something new. Not the isolation of being rare sparks of consciousness in a vast, dead cosmos, but the belonging that comes from recognizing ourselves as expressions of a universe that is itself alive, aware, evolving. The darkness between stars no longer represents emptiness, but potential, the fertile void from which all possibility emerges. The monster, whatever it was, has become part of this story, not an interruption from outside, but a chapter in the continuing narrative of consciousness unfolding through cosmic time. Its timestamp, 02:37 a.m. somewhere over the Pacific, marks not an endpoint but a threshold crossed, a doorway opened that can never fully close again. And so we continue, changed but still becoming, carrying within us the seeds of awareness that the monster helped awaken. Each sunrise reminds us that we are part of cycles larger than ourselves. Each sunset invites us to rest in the mystery that cradles all knowing. Between them, in the ordinary moments of everyday existence, we practice living with expanded perception, seeing the infinite in the finite, the extraordinary within the ordinary, the cosmic drama playing out in each human life. Perhaps this is the monster's most lasting gift, not the dramatic revelations of its passing, but the quiet transformation of how we experience being alive, being conscious, being human in a universe revealed to be far stranger, far more alive, far more filled with possibility than we had dared to imagine. In that transformation lies the potential for a new chapter in Earth's story, in humanity's development, in the evolution of consciousness itself. What began with a timestamp continues with each moment of awareness, each recognition of wonder in the seemingly familiar, each expansion of what we thought possible. The monster's story isn't over. In many ways, it has only just begun,